No, there has to be another donor. Check again.
We already did.
My mother said she'd match.
I'm sorry, she isn't compatible.
Then find someone else.
Claire, your condition is getting worse.
I said find somebody else.
There is one perfect match.
Who?
Your father.
No.
We need your decision quickly.
I would rather die than owe him anything.
For 15 years, Claire Bennett spoke about her father as if he were already dead. She erased every photograph that had his face in it, ignored every birthday card he ever sent, and told anyone who asked that the men who raised her had abandoned his family without looking back. In her mind, there was no mystery about what happened. Her mother had spent years reminding her of the night Richard Bennett packed a suitcase, walked out of their suburban Ohio home, and never returned. Claire remembered the shouting through the walls, the sound of dishes breaking in the kitchen, and the way her mother collapsed onto the living room floor crying after the front door slammed shut. She remembered standing at the upstairs window as her father sat in his truck for nearly 10 minutes in the rain before finally driving away into the darkness. That image stayed in her mind longer than any childhood memory she had. A little girl watching the men she trusted most disappear from her life without explanation. But what Claire never knew was that the story she spent most of her life believing was incomplete. At 34 years old, Claire Bennett was now lying in a hospital bed connected to machines that were slowly keeping her alive. The doctors spoke carefully around her, but the fear in their voices was becoming impossible to ignore. Her kidneys were shutting down faster than anyone expected. Every dialysis treatment left her weaker than before. Her skin had turned pale, her body exhausted, and her future uncertain. Friends volunteered to get tested. Co-workers shared donation posts online. Even distant relatives came forward hoping they could help save her life. One by one, every test came back with the same answer. Not compatible. Not a match. Not possible. Then came the call that changed everything. A doctor entered her room carrying a file so thin it almost looked empty. He paused before speaking, as though he already understood the emotional damage his next sentence would cause. Claire expected another rejection, another dead end, another reminder that time was running out. Instead, the doctor quietly explained that there was one person whose test results showed a nearly perfect match. One person with the exact blood markers she needed. One person whose kidney could save her life. Her father. The same man she had not spoken to in nearly 15 years. The same man she blamed for destroying her childhood. The same man she refused to invite to her college graduation, her wedding, and the funeral of her grandmother. For a moment, Claire thought the hospital had made some kind of mistake. She actually laughed in disbelief before realizing the doctor was serious. Out of millions of people, the only person capable of saving her life was Richard Bennett. A man she had spent half her lifetime pretending no longer existed. And what happened next would uncover a secret that had been buried inside this family for nearly 2 decades. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. When Richard Bennett's phone began vibrating that night, he was sitting alone in a small repair shop outside Indianapolis finishing paperwork long after closing hours. He almost ignored the call because the number was unfamiliar. But something made him answer anyway. On the other side of the line was a voice he had not heard in almost 15 years. Older now. Weaker. Shaking. Dad. People who knew Richard later said the silence that followed lasted so long they thought the call had disconnected. Because for 15 years, Richard Bennett had lived with the belief that his daughter would rather die than ever speak to him again. He kept old photographs of Claire hidden inside a drawer at work because he could not bear displaying them openly. Every birthday, he wrote her letters he never mailed. Every Christmas, he drove past the street where she used to live just to see if the house lights were still the same. He followed her life from a distance through public social media posts and mutual acquaintances who never realized he was listening carefully to every detail they mentioned. But despite all those years of silence, despite every ignored voicemail and unopened card, Richard did not hesitate when he heard why she was calling. "I'll do it," he said immediately. No anger. No hesitation. No conditions. And that should have been the moment this broken family finally began healing. But instead, it became the beginning of something nobody saw coming. Because as doctors prepared for the transplant procedure, Claire started discovering pieces of the past that did not fit the version of events she had been told her entire life. Old financial records. Medical documents hidden inside storage boxes. Letters written in her father's handwriting that had never reached her mailbox. Small details her mother avoided explaining whenever questions came up. Tiny cracks in a story she once believed without hesitation. Then Claire uncovered one particular document dated just 3 months before her parents divorced. And suddenly, everything she thought she knew about her father changed. Claire Bennett spent 15 years convincing herself that hatred was easier than grief. It became part of her identity so gradually that she no longer noticed how deeply it controlled her life. Whenever someone mentioned her father's name, her entire expression changed. Friends learned not to ask questions. Co-workers stopped bringing him up after hearing the sharpness in her voice whenever she described the divorce. To Claire, Richard Bennett was the man who walked away from his family and never looked back. That was the story she carried into adulthood, into marriage, into every major decision of her life. And for years, nobody challenged it. But inside the hospital room where doctors now monitored the slow failure of her kidneys, that story was beginning to crack apart piece by piece. The strange part was not that Richard agreed to donate. The strange part was how quickly he said yes. The transplant coordinator later admitted she had rarely seen someone respond with such certainty. There were no questions about recovery time, medical risk, or financial cost. Richard did not ask whether Claire wanted to see him first. He did not demand forgiveness. He did not even ask whether she regretted cutting him out of her life for over a decade. The moment he learned his daughter needed help, he agreed to undergo every required test without hesitation. And somehow, that disturbed Claire more than if he had refused. Because people who abandon their families are supposed to move on. They are supposed to build new lives, forget birthdays, stop caring, and eventually disappear emotionally. That was the image Claire spent years creating in her mind. A selfish man who chose freedom over responsibility. A father who replaced his wife and daughter with a different life somewhere else. But Richard Bennett did not behave like someone who stopped caring. Every nurse who interacted with him noticed the same thing almost immediately. He looked terrified for Claire. Deeply terrified. Not guilty. Not defensive. Afraid. That contradiction planted the first seed of doubt in Claire's mind. While doctors prepared for the possibility of surgery, memories Claire had buried for years slowly began resurfacing. She remembered how her father used to wait outside her elementary school every Friday with chocolate milkshakes during the summer. She remembered the camping trips he planned months in advance and the way he used to stay awake beside her bed whenever she got sick as a child. Those memories never completely disappeared, but after the divorce, she trained herself to ignore them. Linda Bennett had spent years reminding Claire of the pain Richard caused their family. According to her mother, Richard had walked away voluntarily. He chose himself over his wife and daughter. End of story. But now Claire kept replaying one memory she had not thought about in years. The night her father left, he looked devastated. Not angry. Not relieved. Devastated. That detail suddenly bothered her in a way it never had before. And there were other things that no longer made sense. If Richard truly abandoned his family, why did he continue sending birthday cards for years after the divorce? Why did he keep paying certain bills long after he moved out? Why did he attend Claire's high school graduation secretly, standing far behind the crowd where nobody noticed him? Claire only learned about that recently after an old family friend mentioned seeing him there. According to Linda, Richard never cared enough to show up. But someone had clearly lied. The deeper Claire thought about it, the more uncomfortable she became. Then came another discovery that shook her even further. During routine transplant evaluations, doctors began reviewing Richard Bennett's medical history more carefully. At first, everything seemed normal for a man his age. But one specialist noticed inconsistencies in older records connected to a private neurological clinic in Chicago. Additional scans were ordered quietly without immediately informing Claire. What those scans revealed caused serious concern among the medical team. Suddenly, conversations inside hospital hallways became more guarded whenever Claire approached. Doctors lowered their voices. Nurses exchanged uncomfortable looks. Something about Richard's condition was forcing surgeons to reconsider whether the transplant should even happen. Claire sensed it immediately. And for the first time since reconnecting with her father, fear began creeping into her mind for an entirely different reason. Because the doctors had just discovered something even more shocking. Long before hospital machines, transplant evaluations, and years of silence separated them, the Bennett family once looked like the kind of American family people quietly envied. They lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, where every house had trimmed lawns, basketball hoops in the driveway, and front porches lit warmly at night. Richard Bennett worked long hours managing a construction supply company while Linda Bennett handled most things inside the home. To neighbors, they looked steady and dependable. The kind of couple people assumed would grow old together. Summer weekends were filled with backyard barbecues where Richard grilled burgers while Claire chased fireflies across the yard with other neighborhood kids. Christmas mornings looked like scenes from old family movies, wrapping paper scattered everywhere while Richard filmed Claire opening presents with a camcorder he carried constantly during her childhood. There were camping trips near Lake Erie, baseball games during humid July evenings, road trips packed with fast food wrappers and music playing too loudly through old car speakers. And at the center of nearly every memory stood Richard Bennett, patient and smiling beside his daughter. Claire absolutely adored her father growing up. When she was 6 years old, she followed him everywhere around the house carrying a plastic toy hammer because she wanted to help him fix things. Richard taught her how to ride a bicycle on a quiet street near their home after weeks of her being too afraid to let go of the handlebars. He sat through terrible elementary school music recitals with genuine enthusiasm and once drove 3 hours overnight during a snowstorm just to make it back in time for her 5th-grade talent show. In Claire's eyes, her father could do almost anything. He was calm in situations where other people panicked, patient when Linda became frustrated, and deeply protective of his family. Even years later, after the divorce poisoned nearly every memory she had of him, Claire still struggled to completely erase those early moments from her mind. Linda Bennett, on the surface, appeared equally devoted. She attended every school function, organized family gatherings, and kept the household running with almost obsessive precision. But beneath that warmth was a quieter side Claire did not fully understand as a child. Linda had a way of controlling emotions inside the home without raising her voice. If she became upset, everyone felt it immediately. Entire evenings could change based on her mood. Richard usually responded by becoming quieter whenever tension appeared, often apologizing simply to avoid conflict. At first, Claire interpreted that as kindness. Only later would she realize how much emotional pressure existed inside the house long before the marriage finally collapsed. The cracks began slowly enough that Claire barely noticed them at first. Late-night arguments behind closed bedroom doors became more common once she entered middle school. Sometimes she would wake up around midnight and hear muffled shouting downstairs followed by long stretches of silence. Richard started spending more time away from home claiming work had become demanding, while Linda grew increasingly suspicious of nearly everything he did. Bills occasionally piled up unopened on the kitchen counter. Dinners became quieter. The laughter that once filled family vacations slowly disappeared. Claire remembered sitting at the table one night while her parents barely spoke to each other for nearly 20 minutes except for short, cold exchanges about school schedules and grocery shopping. The silence felt heavier than shouting. Then came the phone calls. Richard occasionally stepped outside to answer them privately, speaking so quietly Claire could never hear full conversations. Linda noticed too. Claire would later remember the expression on her mother's face every time Richard walked away holding his phone. Not sadness. Fear. Mixed with anger. Soon after, Linda began making subtle comments to Claire that planted suspicion without directly saying much at all. She would ask questions like, "Has your father been acting strange lately?" Or, "Do you think families should keep secrets from each other?" At the time, Claire barely understood what her mother was implying. But little by little, Linda shaped the way her daughter viewed Richard long before the divorce officially happened. Meanwhile, Richard himself seemed to be changing. He looked exhausted constantly. Sometimes Claire caught him staring blankly at nothing while sitting alone in the garage late at night. He forgot small things he normally never forgot, like picking Claire up from soccer practice or paying utility bills on time. Once, Claire walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and saw him quickly stuffing medical paperwork into a drawer before Linda entered the room. When Claire asked what it was, Richard smiled nervously and changed the subject immediately. That moment stayed buried in her memory for years without meaning anything to her. By the time Claire turned 16, the atmosphere inside the Bennett home had become unbearable. Arguments happened openly now. Linda accused Richard of destroying the family while Richard mostly stood there in silence, refusing to defend himself properly. Claire became convinced there had to be another woman involved because Linda repeated the accusation often enough that it eventually felt true. Sometimes Linda cried while telling Claire that her father cared more about his other life than his own family. Other times she became cold and distant, warning Claire not to trust men who disappear emotionally. Richard never fully denied any of it. And that silence slowly convinced Claire her mother must be telling the truth. Then came the divorce. Claire still remembered the courthouse hallway vividly years later. The fluorescent lighting. The stale smell inside the building. Linda sitting stiffly beside her, wiping tears from her face while Richard stood alone near a vending machine looking completely broken. He looked older somehow, as though months of stress had aged him all at once. After the hearing ended, Richard approached Claire outside in the rain while carrying a single suitcase toward his truck. His hands were shaking badly enough that he dropped his keys trying to unlock the door. "Claire, please, there are things you don't understand yet," he said softly. Before he could continue, Linda stepped forward immediately. "Your father chose another life over us," she said coldly. Claire turned toward Richard, waiting for him to deny it. He opened his mouth. Then stopped. That moment changed everything. Because instead of defending himself, Richard lowered his head and said nothing. To Claire, that silence sounded exactly like guilt. She exploded at him right there in the courthouse parking lot, screaming through tears while rain poured around them. She accused him of abandoning the family, ruining her childhood, destroying her mother's life. Richard listened without interrupting once. And when Claire finally stopped speaking, he simply whispered, "I'm sorry." Not, "It isn't true." Not, "Your mother is lying." Just, "I'm sorry." Minutes later, Claire stood beneath the courthouse awning watching Richard Bennett drive away into the storm alone. That was the last time she would speak to her father for nearly 15 years. For years after the divorce, Claire Bennett treated silence like a weapon. At first, it hurt her to ignore her father's attempts to contact her. But eventually, it became easier. Then normal. Then permanent. Richard Bennett mailed birthday cards every single year without fail, always writing long handwritten notes inside as though he still believed his daughter might eventually read them one day. Most of those envelopes came back unopened with "Return to sender" stamped across the front. The few voicemail messages he left were never answered. Claire deleted them after listening to only the first few seconds. Sometimes he called during holidays. Sometimes during major storms when he knew she hated driving in bad weather. Once, he left a voicemail simply because he heard on the news that there had been an accident near the highway she used for work every morning. Even then, Claire refused to respond. Over time, resentment stopped feeling like anger and started feeling like identity. Claire told herself she no longer cared about Richard Bennett, but in reality, her hatred shaped almost every emotional decision she made. She became fiercely independent, suspicious of abandonment, and deeply uncomfortable with vulnerability. Friends noticed how quickly she pulled away whenever relationships became emotionally complicated. Even her husband, Mark, later admitted there were moments during their marriage when it felt like Claire was constantly preparing herself to be disappointed by someone. Somewhere deep inside, the 16-year-old girl standing in the rain outside the courthouse never truly moved on. Meanwhile, Richard Bennett grew older in quiet isolation. After leaving Ohio, he relocated to a smaller town outside Indianapolis where almost nobody knew anything about his past. He rented a modest apartment above an auto repair garage during the first few years after the divorce before eventually opening a small equipment repair business of his own. Former co-workers later described him as dependable but distant. He rarely talked about family unless someone specifically asked. Holidays were especially difficult. Every Christmas, he continued buying gifts for Claire even though he knew she would never receive them. Neighbors occasionally saw him sitting alone outside his shop late at night holding old photographs while snow fell quietly around him. He never remarried. Never had more children. Never publicly blamed Linda or Claire for cutting him off. Instead, he carried the silence alone year after year. The final confirmation that Claire truly no longer wanted him in her life came when she got married at 31. Richard only learned about the wedding through social media photographs posted by distant relatives. Claire walked down the aisle smiling beside Linda while every chair inside the church was filled except for one. The seat reserved for the bride's father remained empty throughout the ceremony. According to relatives who attended, Linda told guests Richard was no longer part of the family and that Claire preferred not to discuss him. But what nobody inside the church realized was that Richard Bennett had actually driven nearly 4 hours to be there. He parked across the street shortly before the ceremony started and watched guests enter from inside his truck. Several witnesses later remembered seeing an older man standing near the back of the parking lot holding a small wrapped box before quietly leaving before the reception began. Inside that box was a necklace Claire never knew existed. Years passed like that. Pain turning into routine. Silence becoming permanent. Then suddenly, without warning, Claire's life began falling apart. At first, the symptoms seemed harmless enough. She felt tired constantly, but blamed stress from work. Then came the headaches, the dizziness, the unexplained swelling in her hands and ankles. Mark urged her repeatedly to see a doctor, but Claire kept postponing appointments, convinced she was simply exhausted. Eventually the fatigue became impossible to ignore. She struggled climbing stairs without losing breath. Nosebleeds started happening randomly in the middle of conversations. One morning, she collapsed in her office restroom after nearly fainting while washing her hands. Within days, doctors ordered extensive testing. Then came the diagnosis. Severe kidney failure. The words barely felt real when doctors first explained them. Claire sat frozen while specialists described dialysis schedules, transplant waiting lists, medication complications, and rapidly declining kidney function. The room suddenly felt smaller around her. At 34 years old, she was being told her body was shutting down. Without a transplant, her future became frighteningly uncertain. Linda Bennett immediately stepped forward offering to donate. In many ways, she seemed almost desperate to help. She attended every appointment, challenged every doctor, researched every possible treatment option online late into the night. For a brief moment, Claire believed this crisis might finally bring some peace back into her fractured family. But after extensive compatibility testing, doctors delivered another devastating answer. Linda was not a match. Neither were cousins. Not friends. Not co-workers. Not even distant relatives. One by one, every possibility disappeared. And with each passing week, Claire became weaker. Dialysis drained her physically and emotionally. Her skin turned pale. Dark circles formed beneath her eyes. She stopped recognizing the exhausted woman staring back from hospital bathroom mirrors. Doctors became increasingly concerned about how quickly her condition was progressing. Eventually, one transplant specialist sat beside her hospital bed and explained gently that time was no longer on their side. Then the final test results came back. The room went completely silent. A doctor entered carrying a folder while several nurses exchanged uneasy glances behind him. Claire immediately sensed something unusual before anyone spoke. The monitor beside her bed beeped steadily through the silence while Linda sat rigid in her chair gripping Claire's hand tightly. The doctor opened the file slowly. "There is one viable donor match," he said carefully. Claire looked up immediately. A very strong match. For a moment, hope returned. Then the doctor said the name. Richard Bennett. Everything inside the room seemed to stop moving. Claire stared blankly at the doctor, genuinely unable to process what she had just heard. Linda's face drained of color almost instantly. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Richard Bennett. The one name Claire Bennett never expected to hear. For 15 years, she blamed her father for destroying her family. For 15 years, she ignored his calls, rejected his letters, and convinced herself she never wanted to see him again. And now, the only person capable of saving her life was the man she hated most. But the question wasn't whether Richard Bennett was a match. The real question was, would he agree to save the daughter who hadn't spoken to him in nearly 15 years? And if he did, could Claire live with the truth she might uncover afterward? Because what nobody realizes yet is that this transplant is about to expose a family secret that has remained hidden for almost 2 decades. A secret that will completely change everything Claire believes about her father. Before we continue into part 2, tell us in the comments. What would you do if the only person who could save your life was someone you hadn't spoken to in 15 years? And do you think Claire should call her father? Also let us know where you're watching from. We always enjoy seeing how many cities, states, and countries are joining us for these stories. If you're enjoying this documentary, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because in part 2, Claire finally speaks to Richard Bennett for the first time in 15 years. Hidden letters begin surfacing. Long-buried medical records reveal a devastating truth. And Claire discovers that the men she spent years hating may have been sacrificing everything for her all along. We'll see you in part 2.